Hey there, I'm Tracy Rigdon, and this is the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Often random, but always relevant, always real, and practically nothing is off limits. This podcast is for you. Are you ready for this? Let's do it. Welcome back to the program, guys, and thank you so much for joining us for another edition of the podcast. You know, if some of you guys have been following us for any time at all, you'll know that probably the last half a dozen or so of our guests have come on here and said that they have a podcast, or a couple of them have said that, well, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. And then we have still yet a couple more that have told us, well, you know, if you're in media, you absolutely have to have a podcast. Cole Pepper told us, he said, well, that's part of the rules. I think it's in my contract. So joining me today, the founder of Jax Podcasters Unite group is Mr. Badr Milligan. Badr, how you doing, buddy?
I can't complain, Tracy. Like I said earlier, it's Friday. The only thing that would have made this Friday better is if it would have been a payday Friday. But I'm okay with it just being Friday. Yeah, I'm happy.
There you go. There you go. And the weather has just been gorgeous the last few days.
You know it, man. Yeah, absolutely. No complaints from me over here, Tracy.
Now, you know, I mentioned the reason why I mentioned podcasting, and for the people that are listening or viewing, that I decided that, you know, since I had so many guests before that had been, you know, mentioning it and said they had just, you know, some success with their podcast, and one recently, Eden Kendall, she's got a podcast that's pretty darn successful. I thought that, you know, you and I could talk about podcasting and your journey in podcasting. Now, you've been doing it for several years too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If there's one thing I can talk about, it's podcasting. I could talk about a lot of things. I could talk about comic books all day and music and records. I could definitely talk about podcasting, which feels super meta, right? A podcast, I could talk about podcasting. It's almost, it's obnoxious just hearing it already, but absolutely, let's talk about
it. Now, when you first started doing podcasting, what in the heck was it that, you know, made you decide to do it? I mean, was it a curiosity of some kind, or?
To be honest with you, it was the barrier of entry was absolutely nothing for me in my particular situation. It was also an intrigue and the ability to hang out with friends. And I guess just to expand on that and give specifics, I started podcasting around 2012, but a few years prior to that, you know, 2011, 2010 kind of time frame, I was good friends with an individual named Walter Gant, who was a part of a podcast called the Side Hustle Podcast, which was one of the earliest podcasts I had ever been exposed to, I ever listened to. That, and especially when you think of Jacksonville podcast history, they were some of the earliest podcasters around, and their whole shtick and their show was about, like, it was a comedy show. They recorded on Fridays. All of them, it was 4 different guests: Scott, Cody, Walt was on the show, and Will Leroy was on the show, and they would hang out every Friday, record this podcast, and they would talk about work. They would talk about, you know, news headlines, and they all brought very different perspectives. They were all from different backgrounds. They were all very funny. They had great chemistry. So every Friday they would get together, record this podcast. I was hanging out with Walt at the time because I was working at a comic shop that he would come frequent all the time. So I got to know Walt. I got to know the rest of the crew, and I became a huge fan of their show. Like, I would ask if I could go sit in on a recording, and, you know, I would listen to all the episodes. I would make jokes to Walt about them. And then eventually Scott, who is the leader and the host of the Side Hustle, he just had a bunch of equipment. He was in bands. He would have bands come to his house to practice. He had all this awesome equipment. He had this badass barn in his backyard. It was like a shed/barn/garage, and he converted it to like a studio. So that's where they recorded the Side Hustle. And he had a very early idea, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, 2010, 2011, he had the idea of making a network at the time. But at the time, he didn't know to call it a network. He was like, well, you know, I've got all this equipment. Let's get some other podcasters in here. And he offered Walt the chance to do his own spinoff show or his own show. And Walt approached me and my best friend Andrew Torres, who was also working at the same comic shop I was, about doing a
Mhm.
podcast, because we would all hang out like every Wednesday. We'd hang out because that's when new comics hit comic shops. But we would hang out at the shop, whether I was working or if Drew was working, I'd go up there, or if Walt was there, I would make my way up there, and we would just spend hours talking about the newest
Mhm.
comics. We also were really into music, and one day he came up to both of us and was like, "Hey, Scott is letting me use his equipment. What do you guys think about starting our own podcast and talking comics instead of like, standing
Yeah.
out front of this shop for hours every, Wednesday and Friday? How about we just take the conversation behind the mics?" And that was really the birth of the podcasting. So it was like the barrier of entry was extremely low. I'd have to pay for equipment. Someone else was handling it. And it was
Yeah,
an
nothing
excuse
wrong with
to like,
that.
exactly. Yeah. So it was an excuse to like hang out with my friends and, on a schedule coordinated basis. I mean, how could I say no?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And, like you said, you mentioned, I kind of stumbled into it myself, and it was like I told you, it was pre-COVID. We were in a studio, which kind of we just stumbled into basically. And then when COVID hit, I decided I wanted to keep doing it, and we already had a backlog of about 40, 30 or 40 episodes that were filmed in the studio already, and the guy was volunteering his time to be the producer. So he would record them, and then he would load them up to YouTube, and then we just released them once a week, right? And so all this stuff was already done, but we were not in the studio, and I had time on my hands, and we were locked down. So I said, well, what the heck? I can keep doing it here at my house. I'm out in Middleburg, so I, I I said, well, what the heck? I'll grab me one of my mics and set something up and just keep doing it, and that's how I fell into it, and I just haven't stopped yet. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
I feel like there's no greater incentive or, um, like ignition for a new podcaster to be born when you consider. I definitely flubbed that up, but what I'm trying to get at is when someone has someone handling the equipment, the editing, and things like that, it's like almost like a no-brainer, right? It's like, oh, all I
yeah,
got to do is show up and talk on the mics. That is how a podcaster is easily born, right there, when all of the
yep,
technical stuff is handled. So I was very fortunate in my start, and really, I had that opportunity and that it kind of I had that privilege of not having to worry about that stuff for many years, and eventually I did start. I expanded on my own. I learned how to
hmm
edit. I learned how to buy equipment. I started buying equipment and building my own studio. But without that start, I don't really know if I would have jumped into podcasting like I did. It was just like the opportunity was there, and it was like very low cost or low risk.
yeah. When I started doing it on my own, uh, I didn't have any. Now I've been around electronics and bands and all that for years, but not this kind of thing. It's
Hmm.
different, and I had asked the producer, when we decided to shut down the studio, he still messes with it. But I asked him, I asked him a handful of questions. What do you used? What are you using to record the system? The shows with and all this stuff. And when I started my first, oh gosh, probably 10 or 12 episodes, I was using OBS Studio,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and I didn't know how to use it. I had to sit there in his studio with him. He gave me a little tutorial, and I was like, okay. He said, well, there's some videos, So I downloaded it on my system at home and started playing with it, and uh, you know, it was a rough start. It was a rough start, and you play with it, you play with it, you play with it, and just like uh, being in those Facebook groups. You know,
Hmm.
I joined a bunch of those little podcasting groups, and just started asking questions, and they would answer questions, and I'd go back and forth. Then I'd play with OBS until the wee morning hours, uh, and like I said, it was really rough, and it to me it just seems to evolve. Over the years, you give it some practice, and
Oh yeah, I mean, the barrier of entry to podcasting now is so ridiculously low and just really kind of
oh
relatively
yeah,
easy compared to like how I had it. I mean, when I started, speaking about like just kind of like that that natural curiosity. I've always been like a techie. I've always liked working on computers and, just kind of knew my way around electronics. So it definitely, I had that kind of basis to work off of, like getting into
Mm-hmm.
podcasting and really learning the insides and out. I do feel like if I wasn't as tech savvy as I was, it would have been very difficult in those early years, because we're talking about, having
Sure.
to learn how to generate your own RSS feed, which requires a little bit of programming or just know how. And,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, looking back at my old audio, it's like terrible, but that's because I put in so many reps now that like I know you don't know what you don't know until you know it. So now I know things about EQ and compression and noise
Mm-hmm.
reduction and things like that. So, but what I always say to aspiring or new podcasters now is that there's so much less that you have to worry about. The level of equipment has gotten better. The podcast hosting has gotten so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, it really was like a silo. Like you had Apple Podcasts over here. Spotify wasn't, I don't even think, like offering podcasts at the time. So like you really had to do a lot of homework and a lot of like research and digging and like to
Sure.
learn like how to get your podcast out there and proper promotion, which at the time like social media was still in its infancy. So the only way that you were promoting your podcast was like you would just hope someone kind of found it or by word
Yeah,
of mouth.
word of mouth.
Yeah, I did a lot of word of mouth. I relied on word of mouth a lot. I mean, in those early years, I was like taking lessons from record labels and record
Mm-hmm.
labels that I really enjoyed and music acts that I was listening to and looked up to, and bands, mentality. Like I was printing out flyers and taking them up to comic shops, hanging up posters, in 5 points and handing out little, flyers at comic conventions, like just trying to get the word out street team style. And in those early years, it was like, and, and then in those early years too, I had no idea about global reach. To me, it was just like a Jacksonville thing, something I did with my
Right.
friends and only people in Jax would listen to. So fast forward now it's like I'm thinking on a national scale, a global scale of how to promote the podcast. And there's listeners in these different states but also these different countries, and it's just such a
Yeah.
180 from when I started in 2012.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Uh, before, I wanted to say something before we go any further. From one veteran to another, thank you for your service.
Oh, it was an honor, and thank you for your service.
I forgot to say that at the beginning, by the way. Now, when you started, you had started your own podcast after those earlier days that you were talking about, the short box. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the short box, yeah, that's the one that I started in 2012 with Walter and
Hmm.
Drew. The show has
Okay.
gone through so many different iterations in terms of like guests or co-hosts. I mean, I've gone through a lot of different hosts throughout the years. So I always look at it's kind of cool to look back and like, oh, this was this phase of the show when we had like Adam and Chris, and Adam and Chris then ended up getting married or had moved, and then these new co-hosts came in. But the short box has been that is like my baby, right? That is like, it's
Oh,
still ongoing. It's, damn near 13 years old. I just dropped episode 450, I think 2 this week. And that's not even
good.
counting like all these other bonus episodes. I mean, I've recorded well over probably 600 episodes. I'm not counting like
Wow.
bonus episodes and shows I haven't released or, other little spin-off things. But yeah, the short box is about comic books, it's about pop culture. It's a weekly show. So I've been doing, it's been weekly since 2012.
Wow.
I talk to comic book creators such as artists and writers and letterers, people who own publishing companies, people who run conventions. I try to put a spotlight on not just the people that create comics, but also comic culture. And the goal is to showcase how I view comic books as like this art form that is used to tell, that is a vehicle to tell so many different types of stories. I think a lot of people, when they hear comic books, they probably think Marvel, they probably think superheroes, they probably think,
Right.
Batman, and that is a part of comic books. I mean, there's no
Sure.
downgrading what those things have done for the culture, but I'm also all about showcasing it as the art form and why I revere it. So that is my goal with the short box, is to have interesting conversations with people that put their blood, sweat, and tears into making the comic books, but also like the fans and other
Hmm.
creators who are trying
Oh
to make
yeah.
comic culture a better place.
Oh yeah, and like you were talking about, I believe we mentioned it earlier about the conventions and stuff. Even outside of podcasting conventions,
Hmm.
you got the comic book conventions too,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and they're
And I
big.
mean, yeah, and the podcast has, prior to the podcast, I mean, I was it all lined up around the same time. As I was getting into podcasting, I was also starting to go to conventions. I'd go to like
Hmm.
MegaCon in Orlando. But through the podcast, I've had the opportunity to go to so many more conventions
Hmm.
around the country. I've been to New York Comic Con. I've been to C2E2. It's in Chicago. I've been to like Dallas Con. And excuse me, thanks to the podcast, I've had the opportunity to host panels at these conventions, to
Hmm.
host interviews, and go there for I don't got to pay for a ticket. I get a press pass, so I get to roam around, and like there's a lot of different perks that come with covering comic books and using the short box to like amplify this hobby that I've had since I was a teenager.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing
Not
wrong
at
at
all,
all. Now, we were talking earlier too. You talk about how it's become over the years. It's really changed so much. Uh, you know, uh, the landscape has changed so much. There's just so many people out there. If you happen to know what is the number of people that continue doing it after they start? I read somewhere a while back it was like maybe 80 or 90% never go beyond a handful of episodes.
Man, I this is one of my favorite stats. I'd never have it pulled up, memorized off the top of my head. But what I will say is Alex Sanfilippo, who runs Podmatch, puts out this not annual, I'm sorry, this a monthly podcasting industry report specifically for independent podcasters. It's on podmatch.com/report. And I'm
Uh-huh.
looking at his report for this month, March 2025. And he's got 34, let's just call it 35,000 total active established podcasters. I wonder if he's got this stat. Uh, okay. So his stat here is podcasting industry totals. Podcast listenership is rapidly increasing, but the number of active podcasts has not changed, making podcasting a non-saturated industry. Right now, on this report, he's got active podcasts as 390,647 active podcasters, which I believe is like ones that are have put an episode out in the past week or past month, compared to the
Right.
total 2.7 million podcasts that are
There you
on
go.
you know what I'm saying? That's like that's only 14% of the total podcasts are active, which is insane. Now, to answer your question in terms of like how quickly they, stop, new podcaster stops, I think the last stat I saw that like really made me go, wow, was something like, most podcasts don't last, past one episode, which
Well,
was
I read that too.
insane.
One
Yeah.
episode. Yeah.
If it wasn't one, maybe that's like really extreme, but I remember it being just something like one or two or three episodes, and it's like boom, they kind of vanish.
Yeah. Then they just give up. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I can't see myself giving up anytime soon. And when you mentioned too at the very beginning, as we talk about that, being able to talk with your friends, and it was a way to hang out and that kind of thing. Well, me being semi-retired and living so far away from Jacksonville, and all of my friends and colleagues and stuff like that are in Jacksonville. It's a
Hmm.
50-minute drive, and so I part of this is me interacting with my friends.
Yeah.
I mean, it truly is.
Yeah, I've got a lot of obviously I've been able to make a lot of friends, that fellow podcasters, both in the comic book space, but also thanks to the Jax Podcasters United group. I've really gotten a chance to um appreciate my community, like looking
Sure.
in my own backyard and seeing so many amazing podcasters that have been doing it for as equally as long. Some are brand new but have found like really great success, and they're carved out their own niche, thanks to their topics and their personality.
Right.
So yeah, I gotta say, like, that is another aspect that really resonates with me, that keeps me going with podcasting, is just knowing that the friends that I've made and the colleagues I've made that like push me and motivate me. And, I can also call up and express, the frustrations with it. It's nice to like have a community that gets it, that just,
They
understands
get
what
it.
you're going through and, is vying and trying for the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. And Jax Podcasters United, it's, like you said, it's all about community. You're being able to, have that community. A shoulder to cry on if you have to, I guess. What what do
Exactly.
you think? What do you think are the key ingredients to fostering a successful podcasting network?
We are not a podcasting network, but we kind of are. We're like,
Yeah, if you're a group, you're a network of people.
well, the difference is, the difference is, I think when I think podcasting network, I'm thinking of a network that owns several shows, or several shows are underneath one
Right, right,
umbrella,
right.
and they trade ads and things like that. And that's not typically, and that's not how we do the JPU. But I
Right.
have described us as a network in that way. But I think the keys to a successful, podcast community is what I'll say is collaboration. Our ethos for
Hmm.
the JPU, the Jax Podcasters Unite, is a collaboration and community over competition. Is, we're all trying to help each other out.
Hmm.
There's plenty of room for all of us to grow, to be in the space and be successful at that. That's the beauty of podcasting, is that it's not like, this might be a terrible example, but it's not like buying a car, right? Like, you're not making
Hmm.
a decision to for one product, right? Like, it's a podcast. You can subscribe and listen to multiple podcasts. As a fan
Hmm.
myself, I've got multiple podcasts that I listen to and subscribe to, and I also am a like patron. I support multiple podcasts on Patreon, and I think that's the thing we try to get across, is that there's no need for competition, is because there's plenty of like listeners out there that'll listen to your shows. So like, let's
Yeah.
share resources. So I think transparency, collaboration, and sharing resources, and then just looking out for one another, like, and showing like a genuine interest in what other people are doing. I think sometimes podcasters, it can be a very me um attitude, because like we're all
Hmm.
trying to, it always feels like we're all trying to sell. We can always come off like we're trying to sell, or trying to promote, and shameless plugs and
Sure.
this. So I think sometimes taking a step back and being willing to, be a subscriber, to use in this case, be a subscriber rather than the host, goes a long way.
Oh, absolutely. And, I want to backpedal just a minute. We talked about those stats about, so many,
Mhm.
millions of them are out there, but only so many of them are still active. What do you think, maybe in your opinion, what do you know, walk out on a limb there.
Yeah.
What do you think is one common mistake that new podcasters make? And, what would you give them? What kind of advice would you give them?
Yeah, the most immediate one that comes to mind is expectation. If I was to pull up, speaking about another report and another little shameless plug for some friends of ours, Buzzsprout will post a monthly global stats report. I'm trying to pull it up now. Yeah, I pulled it up right now. It's a monthly stats report that kind of shows similar stats to what Alex does, but also goes into granular details in terms of like where podcasts are being listened to and downloads and things like that. So on the Buzzsprout platform, they have over 120,000 active podcasts. And if I scroll to the bottom, they'll also show you, based on that number, here is the average episode downloads, average downloads for first 7 days. And it's saying here that if you have 4,700 downloads in the first 7 days when you drop a new episode, that makes you a part of the top 1% of podcasts. Obviously, on we compare, the Buzzsprout platform, but still, that I think this goes a long way to kind of paint the picture. 4,700 downloads in your first 7 days is, that's another, that's the 1%,
That's a
and
milestone.
that is insane. Now, if I'm to look at the other end, for the top 50%, which is the median, podcast, if you make 29 downloads in the first 7 days, you are part of the top 50%. So you know what I'm saying? There's a
That's a
huge
big slope.
chasm. Yeah, there's a huge chasm between the 1% and the majority of podcasters. So I say all of that, and I bring that up to say that expectation, I think can easily be a new podcaster's downfall. I think if they don't come in here with the right expectation and knowing that, hey, your first 10, maybe even 100 episodes, won't, you probably won't get 100 downloads, an episode. And at the end of the day, downloads aren't the most important thing. They are, but they also aren't. It really depends on what you're doing the podcast for. Are you doing it like I did originally, just to have fun, be around friends, maybe get the opportunity to go to conventions and, this and that? Or are you trying to make money off of it? Then yeah, maybe downloads go a long way, or are a priority for you. But even then, Blythe is a great example, who's my wife, but also the co-founder of the JPU. She is quick to tell you her episodes don't make thousands of downloads, but she has been able to use the podcast as a vehicle to get leads and partnerships and get to meet other business owners.
Sure.
And,
Sure.
Get sponsorships that are easily in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. So, it's all about how you want to, what your expectation is and what's your goal of the podcasting. Because at the end of the day, even if you have, let's say the 4,700 downloads the first week, what are you going to do with it? What does 4,700 downloads mean? Like, how are you quantifying that? How are you making that something malleable, or, something that you can hold or use? So I guess that's one of my biggest things. I tell new podcasters, like, be prepared to work. Like, it is podcasting is the barrier entry is much lower than when I started. So it's a lot easier to have a show, record one, and put it out there, but be prepared to be consistent and have realistic expectations and really know why you're doing it. I think if you know your why, then it makes some of those early growing pains a little easier, you're not being discouraged because you have
yeah, those high expectations. That's something, you see that, that first myth, of course, is, I see a lot of people in the Facebook groups, I've just recorded my first 2 episodes. How do I monetize?
Yeah.
I'm like,
I'll
you
I'll
got a
tell you,
long way to go, buddy.
exactly. I'll tell you, I didn't see a dime off the podcast I didn't think about monetization until 6 years in. And that was only because a good friend of mine, who was also a big fan of the podcast, pulled me to the side and was like, you could be making money off this, and you should let people help you. Support. He was saying, I want to pay or show, be a patron. I want to give back something because I know that you put these shows out a week. I enjoy it. You bring value. Let your listeners, give them a means to support, even if they don't at least have a channel or means. And I'm really grateful that, he gave me that, tough love, because, I started a Patreon. It wasn't until 2019 is when I started a Patreon. And it was awesome to see so many people sign up and want to support and keep the show going and growing and give back and just show their appreciation. Man, so I mean, what I'm saying is that took me 6 years. You got to build a community. First of all, you got to build listeners. You got to build a trust. You got to build, you got to bring value. There's so many things that you've got to do first before you even think about making, a dollar. And I mean, let's be real. Monetizing in podcasts, there's no one shoe fits all. There isn't it isn't a threshold. It's not okay, now now you're making, now you've got 100 downloads an episode, now you automatically get this money. None of it is automatic. There's so much legwork that you got to do on your own.
That's right.
The sponsors that I have on the show, I've established that relationship. I built that relationship with the, Ben Kingsbury. He's the owner of a comic shop here in Jax, Gotham City Limit Comic Shop. It was a shop that I was shopping at anyways. He knew I did the podcast, but you know what I'm saying? I was a customer. I built a relationship. I would tell him about the show. And then eventually we were like, hey, I think it makes sense for us to, partner up and collaborate. That is how it's been with all of my sponsorships. And I mean, I'll tell you, same thing with Blythe and many others that are in the JPU. You got to do a lot of legwork. But if you don't have if your show isn't in order, if it's not of quality and something that you can hang your hat on, then people are going to see right through that, and they're going to be able to tell he's just doing this to try to get a quick buck.
Yeah. Another expectation too, like you say, they don't look at that whole picture of all the work that goes involved into it. It's not just getting a mic and a camera and a laptop and bang, you got a podcast, which is basically you can, but
No,
but
100%. If you,
yeah,
when I say it's easy to podcast, it's easy to get behind a mic, press record, talk,
right,
press stop, and
right,
upload that somewhere and it
yeah,
gets out. There's so much more work that goes into,
you better believe it.
promoting, branding. I mean, I can get into like some nitty gritty stuff, but like there's,
You got graphics, social media,
yeah.
several social media pages, different hosts doing this,
But,
doing that.
but I will say,
Getting just finding guests.
yeah, yep.
It's a lot of legwork for me to get guests on the show. And
And
right
that's
now
what I'm
I'm sitting,
saying is,
a couple hundred episodes now, 240 something episodes, and there's a guest or two or even three guests on some shows, and I'm recording 2 to 3 times per week.
yeah.
So
No,
I mean,
I will say, I do want to mention that we do talk about like the amount of work that goes into it. I think the beauty of it is that you don't have to do all that. If you don't want to
no,
be
no,
on, like I think a thing I see a lot on, like our podcasts or a lot of Facebook groups that I'm on, like the topic of video gets brought up. Do I need to do video for my podcast? Shouldn't I? And it's like, you don't have to if you don't want to. If you don't want to do
no,
the extra work of video, then don't do it. Just focus on audio. If you don't want to be on social media promoting your podcast, then you don't have to do it. You could still grow a podcast just audio and just show.
right,
It's
right.
going to be, it's going to have its own difficulties, and you'll go on your own journey, just relying on people finding the show. But you don't have to. And I think that's the beauty of podcasting is when you know your why and like, where you want to be at, your comfort zone, and like really understand like how much work you want to put in. However much work you put into the podcast is what it's going to give you. I guess that's what I can sum it up as.
That's right. That's right. Well, and I know that somebody that works, and I know a lot of podcasters that do have full-time jobs like yourself.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult to pump out a lot of episodes. Like some guys I know pump out a lot of episodes.
And I think that's and I've thought, obviously I think every podcaster that takes this serious will tell you one of their goals is I want to be able to I want this to be my full-time job. But, I think at this stage, I would have to make a lot of sacrifices. I think I would have to become something I don't want to be to do this full time. I'd have to be on top of trends a lot. I'd have to be online all the time. I'd have to, like it's asking a lot. And I think I have found a perfect middle ground where the podcast does not pay my bills. I'm not a dependent on it, like, paying my bills and to live off of it. And that means that I can still treat it, I still view it as I still view it with passion and as this hobby that I really enjoy. It hasn't become this slog or this thing that it doesn't feel like work just quite yet. I mean, granted, I do put in a lot of work. It doesn't feel like work. You know what I'm saying? I think for a lot of folks, when they see like your Joe Rogans, your Joe Buttons, your, name anyone else, like they got to remember those guys aren't editing things. They have a team. They have like a budget. They've basically got like a small TV production crew. So, like that is nowhere near the realm of possibility for a lot of us.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. They've got, full studio crew, producer, lighting, all that stuff, and
I think passion is another big thing too. You got to be really passionate about the topic you're talking about, and then treating your, treating your show like something you want to see grow. And in my eyes, the short box is like this living, breathing thing that changes, every year. That, I mean, I look at like, short box episode 1, from the logo, the sound quality, the segments. It has vastly changed to where it is now in terms of same thing, the branding, the look, the sound, the quality of guests, the things we talk about. So like it's evolved throughout this time. And if you're not willing to put in the hours to like evolve a show and like really put in the time it takes, then maybe you want to reassess like, why you're doing it or what your goals are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, Badr, I've had a wonderful time talking to you. It's one of my top topics.
So, Tracy, I won't lie. Tracy, you got me going. Now I'm like, oh damn, I could go for another hour. But I respect that you are a concise podcaster, short and sweet and concise.
Yeah, Yeah, for any of you watching, or listening right now, I had mentioned to Badr before we started that initially, when we were, I have a co-host and we do a live show too on once a week, and so we were going anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, and a lot of ours that we've got on the YouTube channel are over an hour. And so recently, about maybe 2 months ago, we decided, well, we started looking, like you say, looking at the numbers. We started looking at, viewership, and, a lot of people they were bolting after 20, 30 minutes. So we decided, well, why don't we just record for 30 minutes and be done with it? And so far we've been happy with it.
Yeah.
But, before we go, Butter, have you got any words of wisdom for us? You got a closing thought for us?
Oh, wow. I feel like I've been trying to drop those all episode, but I guess if you're on the fence about starting a podcast, or you feel like it's something you'd be good at, give it a shot. Like I said, podcasting might be one of the easiest hobbies or like things to just like get into in terms of like just, jumping in and trying out. I say, don't be afraid to, get on the mic and share your passion and your story with the world. I have been very fortunate enough to meet so many interesting creatives. I view comics and the art form with like a different, like just perspective and reverence based on all the conversations I talked about. And I think if you go into it with that curiosity, with just kind of seeing where it can lead you, if you've got a passion or hobby, I'm telling you, it kind of gives back to you like tenfold.
I totally agree. Well, buddy, like I said before, I haven't been able to come out to any of your meetups yet, but I'm going to make it this year. Uh, when you have one, I'm going to come out there, and you're
Yeah,
welcome to show
absolutely.
up. You're welcome on this program anytime.
Thank you, Tracy. I love, by the way, I'll probably be stealing this, but program. I've never thought to say, hey, welcome to the program. That's great. No, Tracy, we would love to have you out at one of these JPU meetups. You'd feel right at home.
Fantastic. See you, man.
All right, Tracy. Have a great weekend, dude.
Well, that's a wrap. Another fantastic episode of the podcast. You can find us on all the social media platforms, wherever you surf, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter X, Threads, wherever. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. And on our YouTube channel, don't forget to like, share, comment, and smash that subscribe button. If you're streaming audio for the podcast, you can find us wherever you get your favorite podcast programs. In the meantime, I like to tell everybody, take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, peace.